Support for Trifles comes from listeners like you, who support us through Patreon and Substack. Bonus material, thank you gifts, and more await at patreon.com/trifles and at trifles.substack.com. And now you can enjoy some Trifles swag, mugs, notepads, and oval stickers, available in our store. Find it at ihearofsherlock.com/merchandise.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the cyclist was solitary, the bachelor was noble, and the resident was patient, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? On which 3 continents did Watson have experience of women? When did 221B Baker Street first get telephone service? And why does Holmes prefer telegrams over writing?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 471, Upon the Dating of Bloodstains. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the minutiae in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, have you been dating lately?
My wife has a good number of girlfriends, but for some reason she won't let me have any.
That doesn't seem fair.
No, not at all.
Goodness. Well, maybe we can get a campaign going. If folks want to write into Kathy and let her know that, you know, she needs to seize this opportunity and be an equal opportunity wife.
Well, I mean, I call it discrimination.
Oh, boy.
That's it.
Well, nothing discriminatory about today's topic. In fact, it is a Morley-Montgomery Award winner. Welcome, folks, to Season 10 of Trifles. This is the first episode of Season 10, episode number 471, and we are continuing with the tradition that we started last year at looking at Morley-Montgomery Award-winning articles. That is articles in the Baker Street Journal, the official publication of the Baker Street Irregulars, that have been named as being outstanding and extraordinary in their year of publication. They're named after Christopher Morley, founder of the Baker Street Irregulars, and Jim Montgomery, an earlier irregular who was quite the scholar himself. We've got a whole bunch of shows that are in this category. We'll make a link available to you so you can find that grouping of episodes if you'd like to listen to all of our Morley-Montgomery Award episodes. We make it awfully easy for those of you on Patreon and Substack. And of course, if you'd like to support us in either of those, that helps us keep doing the show, putting resources together for just all of the costs that go into hosting the show, online and distributing it, etc., as well as the research and various prizes that we do. At the end of every month, all of our supporters, our paid supporters, are given an opportunity to win a prize, a random drawing for a piece of Sherlockiana. So if you'd like to be on board with that, go right ahead and check us out on Patreon and Substack. The links are in the show notes. Well, this is a particularly interesting way to begin the year, I think. In as much as we ended last year, our final episode was related to the Apocrypha of Sherlock Holmes, a series we did last year, but it was also associated with chronology. And there is chronology associated with this particular article as well. But before we talk about the article, I think it is worthwhile to talk about the author, Robert S. Schultz, Bob Schultz. Bert, give us a little rundown on who Bob Schultz was.
Bob Schultz. Well, Robert O. Schultz, he was invested into the Baker Street Irregulars as the Glorious Scott, which is, I think, a terrific investiture. I don't personally remember him, although he died in 2006, but he was an economist. He worked, I think, for a company called, at least at one point in his career, Econometrics, which I think was part of Chase Manhattan Bank. But he was born in LaSalle, Illinois in 1917, graduated Williams College. He went to work for the Econometrics company in New York, and during World War II, he was in the War Department and came back to New York. He was on the New York Council of Economic Advisors under Hugh Carey when Carey was governor. And he died at the age of 89 in 2006. And he, was a terrific Sherlockian. He came to his first BSI dinner in 1947, and he wrote The Ballistics of the Empty House, which appeared in the Baker Street Journal that same year. And because there was no dinner in 1948, he was largely, it says, in the book where we found his essay, that he was lost to the BSI until 1997, when another article appeared in the journal. And in his last decade, he was a frequent contributor. And here we have it.
Yeah.
His essay upon the dating of bloodstains, volume 52, number 4, Winter, 2002.
And interestingly enough, it wasn't until 2002 that he finally received his investiture. So
really?
He waited an awfully long time after missing that 1948 dinner.
But it wasn't awarded, or he just never got it? Was it awarded until?
Well, the note you read said there wasn't a BSI dinner in 1948. I don't think that is quite true. According to the BSI Trust website, there was a dinner. It was held at the Tennis and Racket Club, I believe, but there was no picture taken, so that may be part of the confusion.
Well, in the book, A Remarkable Mixture, that's what they have in his little bio there.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
So,
but in any case, he wasn't formally invested until
right
2006.
2002. So one of those things where things just get lost in the cracks over time. So we're glad we reconnected with him. He actually became a member of the Beacon Society. I think that was the year we were formed. The Beacon Society is the group that helps teachers and others bring Sherlock Holmes to younger people, to children, to schools, etc. So he was a big supporter of that. We're glad to have him. Anyway, we will have a link to our write-up of Robert S. Schultz on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. We'll have a link to that in the show notes. But this, in particular, upon the dating of bloodstains, is fascinating because, as I said, it starts off with a bit of chronology. We're looking at the adventure of the second stain, and in order to make sense of that, Bob needs to definitively assign a date to it, and the ultimate pursuit of this article is to identify who wrote that letter. That letter that was stolen from the documents box, from the dispatch box of Trelawney Hope. And there are 4 options that he lays out. So we're going to take you through his paper and his thinking right now.
Yes, and as we do that, bear in mind, try to get a sense of what he's done here. I think all of the papers that we've discussed have different fingerprints, if you will. They have different approaches by the author to the structure and to the problem and to the inquiry. But what Robert S. Schultz has done here is produce a beautifully organized, very nicely and tightly written step through of all of these things. And he begins immediately by saying, in dating Sherlock Holmes's adventures, there are 2 approaches. In one, which is followed by Bill Baring-Gould and other Sherlockian chronologists, each story is given a specific date. In the other, perhaps the Vincent Starrett approach, the dates are irrelevant. It's always 1895. Well, for most adventures, that's okay, but sometimes details suggest dates. Charles Augustus Milverton, for example, could not have happened before Hampstead had electric lighting. The three Garridebs, before London had a telephone directory. Such points like these, though, are not important to the stories. With minor changes in details, most of Sherlock Holmes' adventures could have occurred at any time during his years of practice. But in the second stain, there is no such flexibility, while Watson dates it in a year and even in a decade that shall be nameless. The facts of history date the second stain more precisely.
Mm-hmm. And here we enter the realm of high international politics. Lord Bellinger tells us there's a double league which makes fair balance of military power. And that balance is essential to this story, because without a balance, there'd be no bloc that would be eager to antagonize the British public to the point of demanding war. And thus no reason for Lucas to blackmail Lady Hilda, and thus no adventure. But a balance of power wasn't always constant in European politics at the time. There wasn't any kind of semblance of balance between 1871 and 1892. The Franco-Prussian War ended in 1871, and the German Chancellor was Bismarck. He concluded a series of treaties designed to isolate France. And thus we have the Three Emperors League with Austria, Hungary, and Russia in 1873, and the Triple Alliance with the Austria, Hungary, and Italy in 1882. These were major instruments in Bismarck's diplomacy. And he avoided colonial and naval policies that would have provoked Great Britain. So he was very careful about how he steered everything following the Franco-Prussian War.
And then he tells us a little bit more about the Bismarckian structure. Now you can tell, listeners, you can tell at this point that this is someone who is a real history buff, who's sort of dug into this system of relationships, how these nations were conspiring with or against each other at any particular time. And he gives us much more detail. He says, so gradually under internal and external pressures, all of this began to fall apart. The Triple Alliance survived, but the so-called Three Emperors League lapsed. And in 1892, the event against which the whole policy of Bismarck had been directed came to pass. Russia and France signed a dual alliance, and there was now a balance of power. Two vast combinations, each with enormous military resources, were together. Before the dual alliance, there was no double league. So the second stain could not have occurred before 1892. The facts of history not only show the earliest possible date for the second stain, but they also identify both the author and the recipient of the scurrilous letter, and they indicate a date after which the second stain probably could not have taken place.
Oh, that's fascinating. So here, thanks to his wonderful knowledge of history, Bob has kind of triangulated the area in which we need to be considering the second stain. And when Lord Bellinger identified the writer of this letter as a certain European potentate, we know Watson is vague, and so potentate might either mean a royal leader, maybe the Emperor of Austria, Germany, or Russia, or an elected leader, maybe the Premier of France or of Italy. And whether the power came from inheritance or election, Schultz writes, the letter writer must have been the very highest leader of his nation. A message from any lesser one could have been disavowed, or a letter from while the letter from the very highest leader could have roused the British into a frenzy. And he looks back at the history of Sherlockian scholarship and finds that Michael Harrison unequivocally identified the writer as Wilhelm II, Kaiser of the German Empire, as do Bell, Blakeney, and Graysbrook, all Sherlockian scholars. That's H.W. Bell, T.S. Blakeney, and O.F. Graysbrook. But, he says, Anthony Boucher warns against taking this identification too seriously. And even Baring Gould cites a crouching lion as a curious seal for the Kaiser to use. So, study of each of the 5 possible potentates provide a definitive basis for identifying the letter writer. So first, let's head to Italy. What do we find in Italy, Burton?
Francesco Crispi, the premier of Italy. And Bob tells us, by an ingenious analysis of publication dates and diplomatic history, Robert Madison, now I should stop here. You see, what's happened here is that Bob Schultz has been reading the Baker Street Journal and has been stirred into this pot by a paper by Robert Madison, which was done in 2001, a paper called Then, Sir, Prepare for War, from volume 51, number 2. And so now Schultz takes us into what Madison says. He says Madison has combined the Second Stain and the Naval Treaty in an ingenious analysis. Combine that also with the tired captain and a hint of the great hiatus thrown in. And he has a quotation from Madison's paper, which is, early in February 1891, the great Italian statesman Francesco Crispi fell from power, and the government was turned over to his rival Rudini. There were several treaties with Great Britain that, if known, might have threatened the renewal of the Triple Alliance. The rash letter of the Second Stain most likely came from the frustrated Francesco Crispi, who hardly took his forced resignation at this time quietly, but who belatedly recognized that his letter might threaten the delicate negotiations with the Germans and Austrians. Well, that's what Robert Madison had to say a year before Bob Schultz wrote this paper. Now Bob comes back and says, there are several problems with this identification. It is unlikely that a defeated politician accustomed to the limits of parliamentary government would write such a letter on his own. And I can't see why ex-Premier Crispi would write such a letter in anger about any British activity. So far as delicate negotiations were concerned, both Germany and Austria knew of Italy's attitude toward Britain, knew that Italy would never willingly commit herself to anything that would bring her to war with Great Britain, and had required this fact to be specifically stated in the original and secret text of the Triple Alliance. It's difficult to see why a message from a defeated Italian politician should have any impact at all on British public opinion. More importantly, as Madison tells us, Crispi's defeat took place in 1891, and a renewal of the Triple Alliance also took place in 1891, while the Second Stain could not have occurred before 1892.
Okay, so cross one off. And I just have to wonder, when Crispi gets defeated at this point, does he become soggy? Sorry, I had to throw that in there. Now, let's move to France. Sadi Carnot, president of France. Great Britain and France were traditional rivals, and there were serious territorial questions in Africa and Indochina. This is taken from a volume 2 of A Political and Cultural History of Modern Europe by J.H. Hayes Carleton, or Carleton J.H. Hayes, excuse me, Carleton Hayes. And Bob says any one of those questions might have prompted President Carnot, or after his assassination in 1894, his successor, Casimir Perier, to write an offensive message. But again, there is the unlikelihood of an elected official writing such a letter of his own responsibility. Even more importantly, with France's 20-year isolation just ended by the alliance with Russia, no French leader, however impulsive, and whatever the provocation, would have risked pushing Great Britain toward Germany. So, cross off France.
Yeah, so much for that. So now you can see what's going on here. This is all Bob's inquiry around this reference to a certain European potentate. So we've dealt with Italy and France, and then he says, how about Franz Joseph, the Emperor of Austria and Apostolic King of Hungary? Well, Austria-Hungary, which was called the dual monarchy, was seriously troubled by nationalist unrest in its empire and was extremely apprehensive about growing Russian influence in the Balkans, which was a concern Great Britain shared. Franz Joseph was 62 years old in 1892. He was untiringly conscientious and chiefly responsible for major policies, domestic and foreign. He was an elderly man, conscientious, with no particular problems with Great Britain, but with a shared anxiety about Russia. Well, Franz Joseph could have had no reason to write the impulsive, scurrilous message. So that takes care of France, Austria, Hungary, Italy. How about Russia?
How about Russia? People are still asking about Russia. Alexander III, who was Tsar, and the Russian Empire, of course, extended from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, and it wanted to increase its influence in the Balkans to extend its control in Asia. Now, in Central Asia, east of the Caspian, the Russians were moving toward Afghanistan, and that was to ultimately, their wish was to ultimately conquer India, and then thus thwarting the British. And Alexander III was a big autocrat. I believed in the voice of God and in imperialism. And in late 1891, and they were looking to kind of hamper the Russians' move into Afghanistan, the British occupied Hunza and Nagar, slamming the door in our face, according to the Russian foreign minister. And that, again, is taken from, this is from Hopkirk. I thought it was Hayes. Hayes and Hopkirk, that would make a fine legal establishment. Oh, goodness, I don't have the Hopkirk reference here, do I?
He's done his research.
Peter Hopkirk, The Great Game, published in 1994. And, of course, The Great Game meaning the spy play that the British and Russians and others were using in Afghanistan and the Middle East at the time. The move, slamming the door in the Russians' face, might have prompted Alexander to write the letter, that insulting letter. But you got to remember, at the time, Russia was negotiating the dual alliance with France, and Alexander would have been hesitant, as the French premier was just as hesitant as the French premier was about driving the British toward the Triple Alliance. And Alexander then died in 1894, and his son Nicholas II was 26. He succeeded him. And he kind of picked up on the autocrat gene and the imperialistic gene in his father. And Nicholas was charming, but he was weak and resolute. And, well, as some do, he suffered from a neurotic wife. It sounds like an affliction. She was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, remember. And in 1895, again, to stop a Russian advance, the British moved into Chitral. Shortly afterwards, Britain and Russia began negotiations about the boundaries of Afghanistan, and the Russians had no intention of abiding by any agreement. But nevertheless, they thought such an agreement would give them more leeway into the region. And even though he was irresolute, young Nicholas might have written the insulting letter protesting British incursion, but he was unlikely to make such a protest and thus risking upsetting the negotiations by which the Russians hoped to strengthen their position in Central Asia. So there's a lot of moving parts going on with Russia and the various regions that they wish to kind of settle at the time. And it sounds like Nicholas II would not have wanted to potentially jeopardize any of that. Well, I guess that leaves just one.
Himmel. Yeah.
I didn't know Himmel figured into this.
Not Himmler, Himmel.
Oh,
It's
him.
Him. It's quite a lovely paper it's completely a lovely paper. Bear in mind, he started out here by telling us, look, the earliest this could have happened was 1892, and now we've been through all of these countries and looking for the author, this certain European potentate, and we arrive on the doorstep of Wilhelm II, Kaiser of the German Empire, King of Prussia, 33 years old in 1892. He believed strongly in divine right and militarism, and he was vain, he was voluble, he was impulsive. What do you expect? He was a grandson of Queen Victoria. And he was hated or disliked by his uncle. He felt, my uncle never liked me. Well, who was that? Well, that was Albert Edward Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, the eldest son of Queen Victoria, the future Edward the Seventh, was it? And thus then the Prince of Wales. He was Uncle Bertie to his nephew, Willie. He became, yes, King Edward VII on Victoria's death in 1901, but died only 4 years. Now, that says died only 4 years later in 1910, but even I know that's a typo. Even I, with my limited mathematical skills, I can smell that a mile off.
That's 6 years.
It seems like it, yeah. In 1914, Wilhelm believed oncoming war was another plot against him by his now then dead Uncle Eddie, Uncle Bertie. And then there are a variety of incidents, that Bob will take us through that color Wilhelm's attitude. First of all, in 1887, Wilhelm, who was then Crown Prince, represented Germany at Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. And there were other nations that came in precedence to him, and that offended him. And when the Prince of Wales found out about it, he wasn't particularly perturbed, so Willie felt ignored and snubbed at Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. And under Bismarck, after all, because Bismarck was, the organizer here of Germany's political operations, German policies were not inimical to Britain. He was more concerned about French and Russian aggressiveness. In 1890, an Anglo-German entente settled colonial differences in Africa. Germany remained, the master of the continent, while England was the mistress of the seas. So there were limited differences between England and Germany. The Kaiser should have had no reason to write the scurrilous letter, but in view of his paranoid hostility towards his English uncle, diplomatic niceties need not have restrained him. He could easily have been ruffled by another minor or even imaginary British colonial development. He wasn't particularly awed by Bismarck or his policies. He forced Bismarck to resign in 1890, and he probably was not disturbed by the Franco-Russian alliance of 1892. So, of all of the potentates we've talked about, each of the first four had excellent reasons for not writing the explosive letter. Wilhelm II is the only one left, and it's entirely consistent with his personality and family hostility that he should have written the offensive message. So, if you trust Holmes when he says, when you've eliminated the improbable, whatever remains must be the truth, we're left with the author being Wilhelm II. But the question is, to whom? To whom was he writing?
To whom was it addressed? Well, we almost find out. in the second stain. Remember, Lord Bellinger starts off by saying, "It is addressed in large, bold handwriting to," but Sherlock Holmes interrupted him at that point, and we never find out. And we would imagine that it would have been addressed to the British Prime Minister, Lord Bellinger, but a message from Wilhelm II, a royal leader, must have been addressed to royalty. Is it unthinkable that Willie would have written an abusive letter to his venerable grandmother? He must have enjoyed writing such a letter to his hated uncle. Willie was now an emperor. Uncle Bertie, only a prince. Hence Lord Bellinger's great anxiety. Public indignation about an abusive letter to the elected head of the government might have been limited and controllable, but a letter to the prince would have been an insult to the entire nation, to be washed out only in blood. And fortunately, as we know, Sherlock Holmes recovered that letter.
And Bob Schultz takes us to the end where he says, there was another development that also involved Kaiser Wilhelm II, King of Prussia, head of the German Empire. And that was taking place in the Boer War, what would become the Boer War, but in South Africa. And that is the Jameson Raid. So the second stain could not have occurred before the signing of the Dual Alliance, which is what we've talked about before, and probably not after the Jameson Raid, because the Jameson Raid produced a mild form of the public indignation Lord Bellinger had feared. Jameson was an agent of Cecil Rhodes, the South African gold king, and the raid was an attempt to conquer the Boer Republic of Transvaal and add it to the British Empire. 400 Rhodesian mounted police were among the 500 invaders. It was a fiasco. The Boer commandos won. On the 2nd of January, 1896, 5 days after the start, the raiders surrendered. The Boers turned Jameson over to the British, who sent him to prison in London. And from the start, the British public was indignant. And then Kaiser Wilhelm II sent a cablegram to Paul Kruger, president of the Transvaal, congratulating him on defeating the raid, and immediately the British attitude changed. The Kaiser was meddling in their sphere of influence. Jameson became a hero. Queen Victoria wagged her finger at her impetuous grandson. The fleet was mobilized. This occurrence was a mild version of the reaction Bellinger feared if the second stain letter came to light, but there was a significant difference between the two messages. The second stain letter was an impulsive, personal message from a petulant nephew to the uncle he detested. The cablegram to Kruger was no personal act, but a decision of the German government.
And making one mistake that way, sending one message as an act of official policy, it's unlikely that the Kaiser would have done the same thing again out of a personal pique. So it's probable that the explosive message of the second stain must have been antedated to the Kaiser's cable on 3 January 1896. An indication of how the Kaiser had accepted the dictates of policy came a few years later. At the end of the Boer War in 1902, he sent a message en clair to the detested Edward, congratulating him on offering most generous terms to the defeated Boers. So the facts of history clear up much that Watson left vague in recounting the second stain. That letter, written by Kaiser Wilhelm II and addressed to the Prince of Wales, and the adventure could not have occurred before 1892 and probably not after January 1896. May all our difficulties vanish as easily, said Sherlock Holmes in The Hound of the Baskervilles. What a remarkable piece of scholarship. I mean, just very workmanlike.
Yeah, isn't that nice?
Really, really well done. I'm so glad that Robert Schultz remained active in the Sherlockian community some 50 plus years after initially trying his hand at it.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. And he wrote that in his 80s. Isn't that splendid?
In his late 80s, yeah. Well, folks, thank you for joining us on this very first episode of our 10th season. We're gratified to have you along. Again, take a look at the links in the show notes, including our Patreon and our Substack. All of this goes to help you. I should mention that our paid supporters get to listen to ad-free versions of the show and do have access to occasional bonus content as well as that monthly drawing. So check it out. See what works for you. And should also note, if you haven't caught on yet, at the end of every episode, we have some unique quote from the canon, usually some performance that largely comes from the Granada series, but we try to tie it to each episode. So take a listen all the way through and let us know what you think by sending us a comment at trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. The email address is trifles@ihearofsherlock.com.
Yeah, and let us know what you think, because we can't really, we're not going to do this unless we find out a little bit more about what you like and what you don't like. And believe, to us, that's no trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
As Secretary of State for European Affairs, I received the letter 6 days ago. It was a letter from a foreign potentate, you understand. It was of such importance that I never left it in my safe, but I have taken it each evening from my office back to my house in Whitehall Terrace and kept it in my bedroom, locked in my dispatch box.